Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit to the time of the Reformation, because some really significant changes to the Christmas holiday took place during this period. And in ancient times, the Roman Catholic Church celebrated Christmas not just as a one-day celebration, but it was the culmination of 4 weeks of fasting during Advent. And that was followed by a feast to celebrate Christmas. And then there were 12 days of celebration leading up to Epiphany on January 6th. And these are the 12 days of Christmas that you've heard about. This has little to do with the Christmas that we celebrate in America that derives its traditions from a different source. We'll talk about that later. But Christmas, as we know it today, came to America from England, who in turn imported some of their traditions from the Germans. And America also owes some debt to the Dutch. And it's that American version of Christmas that's really the one being followed to varying degrees all over the world. But the Reformation obviously brought a break between the Roman Catholic Church and the followers of Luther, who was a German Catholic priest who initially was trying to reform the Catholic Church, but ended up being excommunicated and ended up leading a movement that is known as the Reformation, which spread throughout Europe and eventually to America. Now, Reformed Christians and Protestants in generally wanted nothing to do with Catholicism, and often even they rejected the traditions and rituals of Catholicism. But Christmas was thought of as a Catholic celebration. So how would it fare in a Protestant world? In particular, how would the Protestant Germany and England treat Christmas? Well, we're going to look at this because it's very relevant to our conversation today. Interestingly, the Germans continued to embrace Christmas, and they just kind of adopted it as their own holiday. Germans had a particular fondness for Christmas, and actually they still seem to have that fondness. I mean, there's nobody that does Christmas like the Germans. And of course, German winters are very cold and dark. In late December, there's only about 8 hours of daylight, and the temperatures average in the 30s Fahrenheit. And so Christmas is kind of a welcome break that brings hope for a brighter, warmer future for those in the frigid north. But St. Nicholas, who we'll talk about in a minute, and who had been the focus of German Christmas, was replaced with Christkindl, and the celebration was moved from St. Nicholas Day, which was on December 6th, to December 24th. See, Nicholas had been a bishop of the church, and the Catholic Church actually canonized him as St. Nicholas. And that was too Catholic, obviously, for Martin Luther and the German Protestants. And so Christkindl means Christ child. So they shifted their focus away from St. Nicholas to the baby Jesus, which is obviously a good shift, but it probably created a rather awkward situation because the previous narrative was that St. Nick gave gifts to the children at Christmas. But now the focus was on the Christ child and how exactly was baby Jesus supposed to give gifts to children at Christmas. So Clark Mortledge says that Luther saw nothing in the Bible forbidding the celebration of Christ's birth, and so he saw nothing wrong with Christmas. Now, there were other supporters of the Reformation who wanted to rid themselves of anything that Catholics used completely. They wanted to just get rid of everything, including Christmas. But Luther himself was wise enough to recognize the difference between things that were overtly Catholic and things that were neutral. So even if the Catholic Church was using things like candles and choral music, those were not thought of as Catholic just because they were used in the Mass. So Luther had no problem using them in the churches or in Christmas celebrations. And in fact, Luther is even credited with the idea of popularizing the Christmas tree and putting candles on Christmas trees. Okay, so the next thing we need to talk about briefly is Christmas in England. And Christmas in England was not actually a very Christian holiday. Originally, it was called Christ's Mass, or a Mass in celebration of Christ. But obviously, that was too Catholic for post-Reformation England. And keep in mind, we're talking here about the 17th century. And Christmas at this time included many of the activities that we talked about that were passed down from ancient Saturnalia celebrations in Rome. For example, remember that whole role reversal thing? Well, that had evolved into a tradition where employees would become the boss in the place that they worked in. Even within the church, acolytes or like layman assistants would take their turn serving as a bishop in the church. And again, keep in mind that although this is part of the history of Christmas, these celebrations were very different. It wasn't just Christmas Day back then. It was called Christmas Tide or 12-tide, which lasted for 12 days, which ran from December 24th to January 5th. This is what that song, the 12 Days of Christmas is all about. Let me just read this little excerpt from BritishFoodHistory.com. It says, quote, 12th night on the 5th day of January is on the last day of Christmastide and was once the party highlight of the 12-day-long festival. In fact, the 12th night used to be the big day where gifts would be exchanged and folk would make much merriment, very aware of the austere months ahead of them. All of this, including the cake, has moved to Christmas Day, of course. The focal part of the 12th night side table was the elaborately decorated 12th cake, essentially a rich fruit cake containing brandy, covered in a layer of rock-hard royal icing, the top groaning under the weight of sugar figures and other intricate sculptures and piping. Inside each 12th cake, a large dried bean or pea would be baked. On the big day, those who discovered them would be proclaimed king or queen for the rest of the day, end quote. And that lucky peasant that got the bean in his or her piece of cake was appointed as what they would call king of the bean or lord of the misrule. And they would be basically the master of ceremonies for the mayhem that followed. Now, this is obviously something that came straight from Saturnalia, where the idea of lord of the misrule or the king of Saturnalia was somebody who was selected from the lower classes every year to rule the proceedings of their Saturnalia celebrations. And basically anything that person commanded had to be followed, even if it was degrading or immoral. But interestingly, both Saturnalia and Yule included some kind of a sharing of wealth. And in England, a variation of this practice took place. Actually, sometimes it was taken to extremes. Peasants would pound on the doors of rich people, and the homeowners had to share the best of what they had with the visitors. And in some cases, if the homeowners were unwilling to participate, the peasants refused to leave until they got what they came for. There's a couple lines in that Christmas song, "We Wish You All a Merry Christmas," that probably don't make sense to modern ears, but you'll understand it in this context. Remember, it says, "Oh, bring us some figgy pudding, and we won't go until we get some." Those words refer to the practice I'm talking about here. And sometimes those people really meant it. They were not going to go until they got their figgy pudding or whatever it is they wanted, even threatening violence if they continued to be refused. And so the partying that happened at that time included drinking, feasting, partying in the street. And there was a lot of immorality and indecency that went along with it. There's a historian named Stephen Nissenbaum that says that until the late 1800s, quote, Christmas in old-time England was really a carnival, end quote. And actually, after the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603, the Christmas celebrations in England became a combination of some of the worst elements of holidays that Americans celebrate today. Like the drunkenness was reminiscent of New Year's Eve. And there was partying in the streets and mask wearing that would remind you of Mardi Gras. And they were going door to door asking for handouts like Halloween. I mean, it was wild. Suffice to say that Christmas in those days in England was not a family holiday. It was an excuse really for people to behave badly. And this type of celebration was on a collision course with the church. And that happened after the English Civil War briefly brought an end to the monarchy in England. And then they were left with a Puritan-led government. Now, obviously, the Puritans were pretty, Puritan. And one of the first things they did was to put clamps on those wild Christmas celebrations that have been taking place. And they actually banned Christmas in 1647 during the brief rule of Oliver Cromwell. And of course, there's a bit of political nuance here that we have a hard time fully appreciating today, because it wasn't just the bad behavior that the Puritans hated. They also opposed Christmas because of its connections to Catholicism. And actually, here's a quote from a sample of a public notice that was used to give this announcement. It says, quote, "The observation of Christmas having been deemed a sacrilege, the exchanging of gifts and greetings, dressing in fine clothes, feasting, and similar satanical practices are hereby forbidden, with the offender liable to a fine of 5 shillings, end quote. I bet you didn't know that feasting and wearing nice clothes was satanic, did you? Man, those Puritans, I think most of us would agree that they probably went a little bit too far in their tyrannical legalism. In fact, they were so uptight, they even banned the making of Christmas pudding. But people are people, and the ones that wanted their pudding found a loophole in the law, and they just imported it from France. So then, recognizing the loophole in the law, the Puritans proceeded to ban not just the making of Christmas pudding, but the very eating of Christmas pudding itself became a crime. So the people just responded by eating mince pie instead. And then 5 years later, Cromwell dies, and the monarchy returns. And with the return of the monarch came the return of Christmas as well. So I guess the moral of the story is, don't put Puritans in charge of the government. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears again, and we're going to talk about Christmas in early America. And of course, most of the people that lived in America came here from Europe, and most of the European immigration took place in the 1800s. And the same is true of most of our Christian traditions. Most of them began in Europe in the 1800s. Christmas didn't come over to us on the Mayflower. In fact, it took 2 centuries before Christmas really took hold in America. And a lot of people don't realize this. Christmas was not always a major holiday in America, and at times it was actually very unpopular. Remember, the majority of the settlers that came over on the Mayflower were Puritans. And we've already seen how the Puritans felt about Christmas. So it shouldn't be difficult to understand that the Massachusetts Bay Colony didn't have a very high view of Christmas in the 17th and 18th centuries. There's a Wikipedia article that talks about this. And it says, quote, "The Puritan calendar was one of the most leisureless ever adopted by mankind." And that's really true. Most calendars in Europe over the last 2,000 years have had an average of something like 240 working days per year. But the Puritan calendar had 300 working days per year. So that leaves 65 days off in a whole year. Now listen, there's 52 weeks in a year. So even if they just had Saturday and Sunday off, that would have been 104 days a year. They got 65 days off a year. So yeah, these were not the most leisurely people, and they weren't big on partying. In fact, even their days off were kind of the opposite of parties. They were like basically Sabbath days and fasts and other solemn occasions. But it's no surprise at all that they would suppress and even ban a holiday known for rowdiness and bad behavior. So at one point, like I said, they actually made Christmas illegal in America, just like the Puritans had done in England. And then came the Revolutionary War, which caused Americans to distance themselves from Christmas even further because, again, it was being viewed as a British holiday. So to celebrate Christmas wasn't necessarily treason, but you might have had some explaining to do. The American government, for its part, frowned upon Christmas so vehemently that they actually refused to give people the day off. The holiday was removed from the calendar, and in 1789, Congress sat in session on Christmas Day and continued to do so for the next 67 years. But by the early 1800s, things started to change. People were yearning for holidays that they could enjoy. And this was the time period when Christmas really grew in popularity in America. In fact, by the early 1800s, even the Church of the Puritans was calling for the observance of Christmas in its churches. And the stage was set for a complete reinvention of Christmas. And this is really where it begins to take on its current form.